Welcome to Authors at Drucker. I'm Dave Specht, Director of the Global Family Business Institute at the Drucker School of Management. At the Drucker School, we aspire to become the global meeting place for the world's most influential business-owning families. This conversation today represents progress in our achievement of that objective. Authors at Drucker is an interview series where we feature top authors that write about issues impacting business-owning families. Authors at Drucker is made possible from the generous sponsorship of the James E. Hughes Jr. Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to advancing the study of family governance and generational well-being. We at the Drucker School feel very aligned and very grateful to Jay Hughes and his foundation. On the last Authors at Drucker, we featured Ken Polk, author of The Spirit of Wealth Preservation. Ken is the founder and CEO of Arlington Family Offices, a leading multi-client family office in the U.S. with over $15 billion in assets under management. If you missed it, please check on our YouTube channel for the replay. Today we're joined by Devin DeCiantis and Yvonne Lansberg. Devin is the managing partner at Lansberg Gersick Advisors, where he specializes in the financial, organizational, and strategic aspects of family enterprise. Yvonne Lansberg, our other guest, is the founder of Lansberg Gersick Advisors. He's a leading consultant on complex family enterprises globally. Yvonne is also the author of Succeeding Generations and the popular book, Generation to Generation. He's also on the faculty at the Kellogg School of Management. Devin and Yvonne, welcome to Authors at Drucker. Devin and Yvonne, welcome to Authors at Drucker. So glad you're here with us today.
So great to be with you, Dave.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So, Devin and Yvonne, before we jump into the book, I'm always curious about how people end up in the field of family business consulting. So, Devin, do you want to start? Give us a little bit of your journey, because I know there's no direct path to family business consulting. So I want to hear a little of the backstory.
Yeah, with pleasure, Dave. As we often joke about internally at LGA, everybody has a career of origin or some path into the field that comes from, distant shores, whether it's investment banking, management consulting, clinical psychology, and so forth, estate and tax planning. My own path actually came through, oddly enough, an American Thanksgiving many, many years ago, almost 2 decades ago, with Yvonne and his family. And he has been the person who has introduced me not only to the field more generally, but also to the practice of how to advise and support families who operate within this interesting niche that once you scratch the surface, you realize this isn't just some one-off or small community of families, but in fact the dominant form of capitalism around the world. And is a former reformed investment banker and management consultant who never really connected with the short-termism of those fields. When I first discovered that there was this whole universe of families out there who were planning for the long run, who were being responsible citizens in the communities in which they operated, who had a primacy or a priority around quality, and who were values-driven organizations and so forth. All of these things resonated with me immediately. And it was a bit of a homecoming. It felt like I finally found a place where I could deploy myself in a way that was in service of organizations that themselves were supporting some really healthy outcomes in the world. And I'm eternally grateful to Yvonne and the team at LGA for inducting me into the field.
Very cool. Well, it definitely takes a mentor and maybe several to be able to navigate these waters to get into it. So, Yvonne, your story of getting into the family business space.
Well, originally I came from a family business myself. My dad was an entrepreneur in Venezuela, and so I'm the youngest of 3 kids when my father began to plan his succession to my older brother, basically, who was 8 years older than I am. I began to get interested in the topic just to look for answers to, what was going on in my own family. Went to the Columbia University Library. There wasn't much written about the topic at the time, and that felt a little bit frustrating to me. So when I finished my doctorate, I went on to the Yale School of Management, and began to devote some research on the area of succession in particular, and put together a little consortia of alumni who run big family companies, and then began to get interested in the first question that grabbed my attention was, why, if planning for succession is so obvious, so few people do it? And that caught my attention, and so that little by little got into the field. There was a time when there was a handful of people around the country who were beginning to pay attention to this topic, and you were talking about the importance of mentors. I had a fantastic mentor. His name was Richard Beckard, who was a professor at MIT at the Sloan School.
Mm-hmm.
And with his encouragement, we began to work on a number of different areas, including the startup of the Family Farm Institute, for example. He was very instrumental in sort of planting that idea in our heads, and a number of colleagues and I got together and started working on that. And within FFI, I began the initiative of starting the Family Business Review, which then exposed me to whatever ideas were then available on the topic. And I've always found the intersections, as you both were talking about earlier, of family and work to be sort of two of the key vectors that drive our species, basically. So, one of the key issues of why family enterprises are so relevant, and one of the points we make in the book, is that the balancing of both of those vectors is ubiquitous everywhere. You'll find it in literature, you'll find it in myths, you'll find it in sort of the origin stories of so many groups around the world, and it's remarkably compelling.
Yeah, Yvonne, sadly, you'll find it in reality TV. I think reality TV has figured out that family business sometimes has great stories to tell without a whole lot of scripting.
Exactly. No. And the problem with that is that it also perpetrates a lot of stereotypes about, families tearing each other apart, and everybody kind of, it's like the HBO Succession series or what have you. But the families that are doing wonderfully well don't get,
they don't get the press.
Yeah. And exactly. So that distorts the perception of what these companies are really about.
I totally agree. Well, one of the things I loved about this book that I have right here, The Enduring Enterprise, is the focus on family businesses in emerging and developing economies. I feel like there was definitely a gap in the literature celebrating those unique families that dance the dance, the delicate dance of survival and thriving and go through these phases and stages. I've always been fascinated by the resilience of immigrant founders, but this really opened my eyes to even those that have not immigrated to the United States. My focus early was mostly in the United States because that was my perspective, and I really had a lot of respect for these immigrants that have come here and figured it out. But you took us back, and this is a fantastic way to study them. Devin, perhaps we can begin with you. Why did you choose to open the book with the focus on the age of uncertainty? Why begin with uncertainty?
It's a great question, Dave, and one that we've been grappling with for a number of years now. To your point, we can study the phenomenon of folks leaving adversity and uncertainty and coming to the stable shores, or more stable and prosperous shores of advanced economies around the world. That's been the immigrant story in places like the United States and Canada and so forth. And we certainly don't want to be fearmongers. That's not our goal. But we do want to frame the world that we're entering as fundamentally different from the one with which we're most familiar. And it's one that will require, at least in our judgment, a different playbook for success. And we don't have to look very hard these days to find evidence of a rising tide of uncertainty around us, whether it's disruptive new technologies that are changing the ways in which many businesses and employees operate, or demographic shifts with aging populations and so forth, or social tensions that seem to be tearing the fabric of societies apart, or market failures that seem to be creating excesses and gaps that make it more difficult to deploy capital, or even climate crises that sweep their way through regions, increasing frequency and devastation. And when you piece all of this together, it's pretty unfamiliar to most of us living and working in the world's most advanced economies, who have only known peace and prosperity for most of their living history. And if you go back about 80 years or so, really to the end of the Second World War, one could argue that we've been living in a golden age of peace and prosperity. And yet the world order that has been built around all of the international and domestic institutions, globalization, the rule of law, economic integration, regional trade, and so forth, that has prevailed since then, have really begun to disintegrate. And as our societies fragment and trust begins to erode, the tailwinds that have supported all of this growth and development, have become headwinds. And many leaders and organizations in advanced economies haven't really ever had to face that. They've never had to navigate in those conditions. And so we wanted to refocus leaders and those who are concerned about the evolution of how this is all playing out, to look to other places and other times where those conditions were pervasive. And rather than seek inspiration from traditional Western sources, Western Ivy League business schools and boardrooms, to maybe, start searching a little more broadly for examples of not only survival, but how to thrive in the face of increased uncertainty and turbulence.
Well, the timing of this book is really kind of quite incredible, especially just with what's going on in the United States. I mean, this book should be for leaders in the United States right now to look outside of the United States to figure out, okay, what happens when there's a regime change? What happens when tariffs, when opportunities that were our competitive advantage are now gone? I really feel like you've laid it out for those leaders. Yvonne, do you want to speak to that at all, in terms of the opportunity for leaders, for corporate leaders here in the U.S. to learn from our international friends?
Thank you. Yes, I mean in the book we talk about the importance of trust, and how people take for granted how the institutional scaffolding that Devin was referring to, that has created external stabilizers, as we call them, that makes commercial activity predictable, right? And how that is for a variety of historical reasons beginning to, a crumble might be an exaggeration, but some mornings I wake up and think maybe it is crumbling. So to your point, the timing is not something that we like, but something that we feel the ideas in the book could truly be helpful on. Essentially, we try and juxtapose two concepts. One is the idea that when you got in an advanced economy, with the institutional scaffolding that provides predictability of outcomes, right? It allows you to then take measures in the way you manage your organizations that allows you to pursue growth as an objective in a more figural way, if you will. The moment that scaffolding begins to shake or even crumble, then the question of how do you pursue resiliency as a separate goal, not that you give up on growth, but you certainly redirect resources to try and create a bubble of stability, as we think about it, within which commercial activity can happen. And we differentiate external and internal factors that contribute to what provides stability externally and what provides stability internally. And internally, we treat the family as a key ingredient, which is one of the lessons we've gotten from looking at family enterprises in frontier economies, where you take the three-circle model, basically, that we've often talked about in the family business field, and you expand the family circle because it has ramifications in the way you treat your suppliers, in the way you treat your customers, in the way you certainly treat your employees and the communities within which you work. And that then creates the possibility of building trusting pockets, basically, that then allows you to navigate the turbulence around you. We feel that that's one of the key differences between these environments.
Well, one of the things I've noticed in my little agricultural community here is that, these families that immigrate and are looking for a better way, I've noticed that they are so loyal to each other. They look after each other. They take care of each other. And there are people here now that are 3 generations ahead of them that have now developed and amassed wealth in terms of land. And what are they doing? They are creating independence from each other as a family. And I see it as almost a disintegration of the family unit because of the ease, because of the stability, because of the wealth. And anyways, it was something I observed even as a young boy. Some of my best friends were from Mexico. I grew up in San Diego, and I looked at the closeness of their families, that I wondered, like, how did they become who they are? And reading your book and kind of looking into some of these concepts helped me to clarify it is the conflict, it is the stress, it is the strain, that where there's not the external support, they look inward. And anyways, that may seem like it was an easy concept for you guys, but it was really kind of illuminating for me.
Thrilled to hear it, Dave. And insofar as in the book, we try to capture some of these ideas. The earliest sociologists, Georg Simmel and Emil Durkheim and others, were observing at the dawn of, or as the Industrial Revolution was really taking hold, this changing role of the family and familial networks, the extended family, as a unit of economic, as the base unit of economic productivity, the household. And what the Industrial Revolution did, among other things, was to break that down even further, to make the single individual human the economic unit of productivity. And that in itself is a disintegration of, pulling family members out of the household to do their work and bringing them into a place where a bunch of other individuals were brought to also do work was a massive shift. And it was a shift in the psychology, it was a shift in geography, it was a shift in urban planning and design. It required different institutions to enable, payments and transactions to happen among strangers, where previously you would walk down the street and ultimately be transacting either with family or friends. Mm-hmm. And that's fundamentally different further down the hierarchy of stability, as we call it, in emerging and frontier economies, where familial constructs make up for many of the gaps, the so-called institutional voids that are persistent in these environments and have been historically persistent throughout much of human history. But among advanced economies, where the institutional scaffolding, as Yvonne was describing, has been erected, and this takes centuries to accumulate this scaffolding. It's that stability allows for people to then be able to walk down the street and trust that they can tap a card and that the thing that they're going to get is going to be what it says on the label, and that it's not going to poison them, or they can tap on their phone and a stranger will come and pick them up from their home and shuttle them safely to dinner, or flicking on the switch will reliably turn the lights on in their home and so forth. All of that infrastructure has allowed us to survive as individuals much more than we ever have been able to historically. And so the role of the family as that internal stabilizer, as Yvonne was describing, has been diminished while all of this other infrastructure gets put in place. And it raises an interesting question. What happens if that external infrastructure begins to crumble? And do we then revert back to our earlier, more primordial familial constructs, which are very familiar to folks who operate further down the developmental ladder, but are a little less common and more foreign to folks, on this side of the Mexican border in San Diego, looking at the Mexican families who are all so cohesive and united, and recognizing some of the dynamics that differentiate these communities, and how that will actually influence resilience of each of those communities in the years ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I find striking is how folks take that institutional scaffolding for granted. They're just little awareness of countries where it doesn't exist and how life unfolds there. I wrote a column once about a trip I took when I was in college with an American friend from Massachusetts who had never left Massachusetts. And when we were driving from New York to Caracas, basically, and when we crossed the border into Mexico, he looked around and sort of in amazement said to me, "So why do they live like this?" And I was the one who had to break the news to him that, hey, wait a minute, 95% of the world lives like this. You don't know what you have, basically.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is also that it diminishes your adaptiveness, right? I mean, there's some wonderful research that we became aware of. Unfortunately, once the manuscript was already written, otherwise we would have written the idea into the book. In medical science, they have found that if you live near a well-developed medical system, your immune system is actually weaker. If you live far away from one, your immune system is strong. This book speaks to the organizational analog of it, basically.
Interesting.
And it's an interesting construct.
Well, as a 19-year-old boy, Yvonne, I left the comforts of San Diego and went to Uruguay. And Uruguay is a pretty tame place.
As a frontier goes, it's actually pretty stable.
But as a 19-year-old young man, I remember the level of awareness and gratitude that I began to have for my parents, for running water, for lights, for the stability of an economy, and I think anyone that lives in this economy needs to leave so that they know what is here, what they have, what the opportunities really are. I want to move on now. A couple of months ago, I interviewed Kim Clark, former Harvard Business School dean, about his book Leading Within. He did a lot of work on modularity throughout his career, and you write about modularity in your book. Devin, I wonder if you can talk about how families have used this concept of modularity to find ways to grow.
Sure, Dave. I'm thrilled to hear that this is resonant with other, leading thinkers in the field. We came across the concept of modularity as one of these 7 stabilizing strategies, these recurrent themes of investment and organizational design that families who were surviving and thriving in frontier environments were deploying consistently. And so we spent within the book a chapter on each of these strategies, and modularity is one of them. And as we studied these successful multi-generational businesses around the world, we actually found modularity to be one of the core drivers of growth and stability. And this was in particular, again, in uncertain environments. And interestingly, for those familiar with the 3-circle model that Yvonne just mentioned, we found it in use across all 3 of those key subsystems: the business, the ownership, and the family. So, for instance,
let me just jump in real quick.
Yeah, please.
Can we go back and make sure? I want to make sure not all of our listeners maybe know what modularity is. Let's define it first, and then we'll dive in. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The aspiration here is to create a system that has many independent but also interdependent parts, which work together seamlessly in service of a common mission. That's sort of our definition of modularity, and you'll see in the examples how this manifests. So, for instance, in business, a company can leverage modularity in a variety of ways. One of the cases that we feature in the book is IKEA. So we can all think of the sort of flat packing, self-assembly models that IKEA uses. So they use modularity in their product design, interchangeable parts and so forth, in their store layouts, the ways in which you grab something from this section and grab something from that section, and you can assemble a finished product and so forth. And even their logistics allows them to offer affordable, self-assembled furniture on a truly global scale. Tesla's gigafactories are another great example of modularity executed, as some might argue, to perfection in advanced economies, where they start with the capacity to produce a certain number or a certain volume of output with robotics that are all interchangeable and hot swappable. And then they can continue to increase the number of bays and the number of banks doing the work so that you can scale manufacturing productivity incrementally to meet demand. And rather than overbuilding and having lots of excess capacity, you can build it incrementally over time, because you've created a common operating system with all of these interchangeable and interdependent parts. In ownership, that manifests, and we talk about in the book, in the context of joint ventures and often franchises, which enable companies, for instance, like McDonald's, which we feature in the book, or Caterpillar or Xerox, to partner with enterprising families in emerging and frontier economies to adapt their American or Western products for local, to tropicalize their goods and services and delivery models for these environments. And that approach to growth and globalization actually emerged over a century ago with Coca-Cola, but was truly sort of revolutionized by Ray Kroc and McDonald's in the 1950s and 60s. And once McDonald's had proven the model, then many others had followed. And so you'll now find in most emerging and frontier economies some cluster of families who have aggregated a variety of master franchise licenses to be able to operate the Burger Kings and the Caterpillars and the General Motors and to sell the Philip Morris cigarettes and so forth. And you'll find similar modular joint venture holders in many of these environments. And then finally, as it relates to families, and we were touching upon this just now, enduring networks of trusted relationships can act as critical support systems, right? They provide access to capital, to information, to labor, to opportunity, and even personal security in some environments. And all comes through the trust that's inherent to or intrinsic to families, right? This sort of reciprocal altruism that is hardwired into our brains. And as we looked around the world, each country has a different name for these familial conventions. So in China, it's called guanxi. In Arab cultures of various forms, it's called wasta, the ability to sort of reach out and seek favor from a familial friend to help you push through a business need. In Russia, they call it blat, and so forth. So many of these countries will have their own terminology. In Uruguay, it's probably called compadrazgo, or there's some other term that captures this sense of, I can reach out to this trusted network that is, sort of lives below the surface. It's not something that we openly advertise, but it's something that our family uniquely has access to, is sort of modular networks of opportunity.
Perfect.
And it's interesting because you also
specifically.
Yeah, sure. What I was going to say is in families, one of the functions of in-laws is to connect familial groups, right? And it's a form of modularity, right? The very fact that you have an incest taboo, as it were, you can marry within your family, it pushes the family to reach out to other families, and then they become the connecting tissue, where in moments of crisis, you tap onto those other subgroups, right, around you that allow you to, provide the kind of trust that we're discussing is critical for sustainable commercial activity in volatile environments. So it's really fascinating how that works, and it goes back to the very origins of the human species. That's how groups of family members in the savannas were able to cope and help each other.
Yeah. Interestingly, those tribes tend to be stable up to a certain size.
Exactly.
And so you can, the coherence of a familial network can only get so large before it fragments and turns into its own subcultures, or it has to be embedded within a larger framing in which these folks can plug into the world more broadly. But humans weren't meant to gather in the millions or tens of millions. It really takes a lot of infrastructure to force us out of our primordial instincts.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there is a point where the family is competing against the world, and then the family begins to compete with each other. I'm not sure what the number is when that happens, but that's something that I've witnessed. Yvonne, another concept that I found really interesting was, again, kind of tapping into the manufacturing again. You talk about just in time versus just in case. Can you kind of lay that out
Sure.
for us?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of just in time is actually directly connected with the stable environments that we were talking about. Because in order for you to be able to pull off a just in time, system, you need to have, supply chains that you can count on, right? So you can reduce your inventory to a minimum, because you're trusting that your suppliers are going to be there when you need them, right? And then you don't have to carry the added expense of a big inventory. In environments where predictability is not there, where volatility is not there, then you have to shift the mindset from that kind of reliability to the assumption that things are going to be coming at you all the time. So you have to really move from an expectation of stability to an expectation of volatility, which then requires you to build in the kinds of resilient systems that allow you to respond to that volatility in a predictable way, because you build the cushion to be able to do that with. There's an interesting idea embedded in that, which is, predictability is never free. It always costs something. So in order for you to be able to adopt a just-in-case mentality, as we talk about it in the book, you have to understand that resources have to be channeled into building that capacity so you're able to respond. It's a little bit like having a spare tire in a car, right? It's good to have it when you need it, right? And you have to carry it around when you don't need it. And it does take room, and it is heavy, and so forth and so on. But boy, do you need it? You're thankful that you have it when you need it. So
yeah,
that's important, because when you grow up in a stable environment, you feel that it's wasteful to channel resources to provide for that just-in-time, or just-in-case mentality. And that's one of the messages of the book is, be careful with that assumption.
Well, one of the things that in our religion we're taught to, in my faith background, we're taught to have food supply, that allows us to, if there's a natural disaster, to not only be able to take care of ourselves, but then to be able to take care of our neighbors. And I found that interesting. I was just thinking about that as you were talking about just in case, because, the hope is that we never have to use it. But the likelihood is, if we have it, we won't use it. We won't have to use it. But if we don't, we're going to be in a lot of pain when those moments come.
Exactly.
Right. As the saying goes, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it.
Yes, absolutely.
If I could just add one other thing, you just think about how unrefined our intuition is, at least for those of us who live in advanced economies around this. So just picture the early days of COVID, and what was one of the goods that was least available in grocery stores to the extent that you could get to one or have it delivered, and it was stuff like toilet paper. I mean, again, when you think about if it was a true crisis, it would be, chlorine tablets for water. It would be, backup reserves of canned food and so forth. But we have such little practice with what it means to not be able to go and get everything that we want on demand, same day and so forth, that we get into this ritual of being able to just reach for and have access to whatever we want, this life of abundance, that facing scarcity for the first time produces all of these dysfunctions in our entire economy, and you see supply chains get snarled up over things we probably couldn't have predicted heading into the COVID-19 experience. And that's another great example for folks who are living and working in advanced economies of what it's like to deal with one of these shocks, except that this is a generational shock. Probably happens once in a generation in the US and Canada, maybe twice, with increasing frequency in the years ahead, but historically quite rare. And yet in other parts of the world, dealing with bare shelves is a daily occurrence. And so when you find something that you can get access to, you end up buying as much of it as you possibly can and squirreling it away because you don't know when the next time will be that it'll be available.
Yeah.
One telling example of that is the size of your storage room in your home. My sister lives in Caracas. So, with this latest bout of stuff with Maduro, she overbuys, because she knows that something could go wrong any minute, and she wants to have a supply of food that she can count on for at least 3 months. So yes. She's constantly reshuffling the inventory of food in her pantry, as it were.
Makes sense to me. Well, one of the principles Peter Drucker discussed, and whenever he was consulting with businesses, there was a concept called systematic abandonment, or the intentional act of strategically looking to kill things to make room for new innovation. I felt like this was married well with your concept of simplification. What are the ways that family business leaders have used simplification to position themselves for new growth or just weathering difficult storms?
I think that one of the key components of simplification is the two ingredients I flag. One is, the key importance of prioritizing your core systems. That you need to know where to cut and where not to cut. And that requires not just, a deep understanding of your operating system, so that you're able to say, okay, we can, in a moment of need, we can reduce our functioning up to this minimum, but not further. The other ingredient, which does actually resonate very much with Drucker's concept, is that you need leaders that are constantly vigilant for monitoring how their operations are going, and being willing to have the courage to cut in the places that are no longer providing a source of stability and growth. In family enterprises, that gets complicated because you may have a cousin or a sibling that's in a division that actually is not performing, and then you get, that's where you need to make sure your family understands its core priorities and subordinates the job of a particular sibling or cousin to the overarching needs of the complete system. But the other, there were lots of things we cut out of the book, and one of the inspirations for our book actually came from biology, and how organisms, that are incredibly resilient. Water bears are the ones that Devin's family particularly loves. Are these little things that, they in moments of scarcity, they can reduce themselves to an absolute minimum. You can you can throw them out in space. You can, they withstand enormous pressures. I understand, and they withstand enormous temperatures. And yet the way they manage their metabolism allows them to preserve the energy needed to be able to survive and bounce back when conditions change.
So I have a question connected to this. Do you feel like it's possible to manufacture this kind of a situation? I'm thinking about my own personal family, and maybe we get a little complacent, we get a little comfortable. Is it realistic to think we can manufacture some sort of event or something like this that would cause something similar, so this similar type of growth or awakening to the fact that we don't need all the things that we have and that we can be happy with less? Or is this a pipe dream of mine?
Oh, Dave, you're hitting on a really important theme, one we touch upon in the book, but which we certainly deal with actively in working with families around the world. And it's this idea of manufactured adversity, right? All it takes is the choice to, rather than go on vacation to the sandy beaches of an all-inclusive resort, to, not necessarily suggesting you do this with the kids, but grab the machetes and head into the jungle and try your best to sort of experience what it might have been like, hundreds of years ago, to discover a Mayan temple and so forth. The reason I raise this is because it does need to be intentional if you want to do this right. We need to manufacture scarcity in this world of abundance, especially if we're privileged enough to have access to the basics and, have all of the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs fully covered. And yet, being so comfortable, we talk about this in the chapter. Hunter H. Thompson has written beautifully about this, that, that we get lulled into a false sense of security and stability. And it limits our potential, but it also anesthetizes us in a way. It doesn't leave us well prepared to deal with shocks once they inevitably emerge. So to the extent possible, I was a Boy Scout growing up, this idea of being prepared, it meant, 4 times a year, we were going to head out into the bush, no matter what the weather was. And we'd have to pack and we'd have to bring all our gear. And some of it was, especially winter camping, a matter of life and death to the extent that we brought the right stuff and we had prepared accordingly. And all of that gives you a stronger sense, especially for those of us who don't get, impacted by the complexities of life in Caracas, in Venezuela, or in Ukraine, or in Syria, or, these other places where many families are forced to operate. When we're in the comfortable, confines of the Upper West Side or San Diego or Toronto, we do need to, get ourselves out of our comfort zone. It's the equivalent of taking a cold shower and to wake up our nervous system. And it certainly has important benefits that we ought to consider.
My biggest fear is that, you have a generation, call it the founding generation, that is so tough, so resilient, so much grit in their lives. And the parent side of us wants to remove all of the obstacles so that they don't have to experience what we experienced. But in the end, we're basically exposing them and making them weak. And how do we fight against ourselves to not weaken our rising generation, but to allow them to inherit some of the grit and the resilience and the toughness that has made us who we are?
It's a really interesting issue, and it has tremendous ramifications for family enterprises more broadly. There's an old saying of Machiavelli's that says that if you get to a position of power easily, you'll have a hard time holding on to it. Whereas if you get to a position of power through all of the rigorous testings that leaders have to go through, it takes longer to get there. But once you get there, you can actually hang on to it in a much more secure manner. And your point is well taken, because you cannot develop leadership without exposing those aspiring candidates to risk, to the risk of failing, right? And parents sometimes overly protect that process and then rob their children from the opportunity to establish their own credibility and their own authority. So it translates this idea very easily into the mechanisms you put in place to build teams that are in fact resilient. It is, I've always been very, very interested in that issue. That the word metal in English comes from metallurgy, which is an ingredient in, the word the metal of a leader is the courage they have to face adversity, basically. And it comes from metallurgy in the sense that you take steel out of the oven, and in order to strengthen it, you beat on it. you beat on it, and that gives the steel strength. But the concept is the same, that the human body, our organisms inside of our bodies are they get stronger as you push them. You need resistance for strength.
Exactly.
Which is a concept that we build into the book in a variety of ways. Sorry, Devin.
No, I was just going to say that adversity is the crucible through which resilience is forged. And we talk a little bit about 100 years or so ago, there were a couple of scholars at Harvard who were observing the correlation between stress and performance and recognizing that too little stress leaves us, complacent and underperforming, and too much stress, shuts us down. We get overwhelmed by stimulus and so forth. And so there's an inverted U-shaped curve, if you will, the Yerkes-Dodsey's construct that suggests that there's some optimal amount of performance that is associated with, not too little and not too much, the Goldilocks scenario of stress, of external stress and anxiety. And we would suggest that something is similar for the amount of resilience that an organization has. That greater resilience is achieved, not necessarily with the stasis and the predictability of the advanced economies. We get a little too comfortable here, and not with the pure chaos of what it's like to operate in some parts of the developing world, especially in those truly frontier economies, of lawless states and so forth. So that somewhere in the middle, the Goldilocks is a place like a Dubai or a Singapore, some place that's developing and that has built infrastructures, but it isn't completely devoid of the kind of self-agency and self-sufficiency necessary to make sure that you can brace for shocks when they come.
Well, one of the other unique components that I feel is connected to this, that is a real struggle for families, is the concept of ownership. It's really tough to train someone to be an owner without exposing them to the realities of what ownership can bring you. And we want to pass assets on to the next generation, but we don't want to give them any possibility of losing, squandering, or struggling with those assets. Do you have any thoughts on how to prepare owners? This is a big question, obviously, and this was not in the notes. But preparing owners, what advice would you give there?
Well, I think actually your point is really well taken, and in the sense that one of the things I think is integral to preparing owners is to get them to understand the risks of ownership. Not just the opportunities of ownership, but the risks of ownership. So, for example, one of the good things I think that came out of the COVID crisis was having owners who took their dividends for granted, to understand that, in fact, there are conditions under which ownership obliges you to forego those dividends and plow them back into the company so that the organism can be protected and continue to grow once the crisis is over. So, as a client once told me, when you get ownership, it doesn't come with a user manual. You have to educate owners to understand the risks they're taking. Why they deserve a dividend is because they're putting their capital at risk. And if you're being brought up under the construct that risk is not there, or that ownership is forever, or that you have no agency over the way that ownership is administered, then you're denying them from the exposure they need to build the resiliency that's needed for sustainable ownership. And we talk about that quite a bit in the book, towards the tail end of the book.
One of the tests that I provide. One of the tests that I provide. I'm sorry. One of the tests that I provide to owners that are trying to pass on assets and trying to figure out if the rising generation really understands and is ready for ownership is I ask the rising generation if they'd be willing to personally guarantee the debt of the company. if they'd be willing to put their house if they'd be willing to put their house up as collateral to be able to have ownership. And it's a pretty good litmus test as to who understands ownership, who really feels committed and convicted that the business is important and that it will succeed. And so I think there are those little tests that we need to build along the way through good questions to be able to not put people into ownership that wouldn't benefit from it. Because as you know, untangling and unwinding ownership is one of the more challenging things to do in family companies. But I think there's far too little work done on the front end to help individuals know just what it means to be an owner.
It's a great point, Dave. In the book and in our practice, we often emphasize, as Yvonne said, education. You got to start there. What do owners need to understand about their business, about their common values, about their shared vision for the future of the enterprise, and to the extent that there is one, and calling that out and to make sure that there's a true coalition of the willing to engage in this activity. It's also really important for families to recognize that there are different roles that owners can play. We talk about these in the book and have worked on this construct with one of our dear friends and colleagues, John Ward, this idea of operating owners who roll up their sleeves and get involved in the business itself and are active in day-to-day operations, boots on the ground, so to speak, versus governing owners who participate in governance, but maybe have a full-time career outside of the business, and engaged owners who care deeply about the enterprise, are emotionally connected, show up when asked to events and so forth, but don't otherwise get directly involved. I think as families begin to acknowledge that owners can take any of these roles, obviously you need somebody making sure that that principal agent issues aren't manifesting in an unhealthy way in the business, and that somebody's keeping a watch on non-family leadership to the extent that there aren't family members any longer in the business. But if you change the definition of what it means to be an owner, and that not everybody needs to work their way and build a career through the business in order to add value to the enterprise, I think it frees up families from feeling like they have to seduce, woo, handcuff their family members to the enterprise in a more meaningful way that distracts from their desire to or capacity to add value elsewhere in the world, and to seek their passions. And so, not presuming that there's only one path into ownership and into the business is a good place to start. And the only other thought as it relates to ownership I'd love to share that we also capture in the book is this idea that governance and the governance system, the ways in which owners gather to make effective decisions about their enterprise, needs to be dynamic. It needs to change and evolve with the context, both internal context, who's there, how the business is running, its complexity and organizational design, but also what's happening out in the world, and how the demographics of the ownership group may be changing over time and expanding substantially, or the geopolitical or economic or political or environmental context within which the business operates is changing. And that means that we expect or need something different from owners, in addition to that skin in the game owner's mindset that you alluded to, Dave, which I really love that concept. It's like, okay, I am going to put my house, on the block here, metaphorically or actually, so it behooves me to understand the risk that this enterprise is taking on, and of course the opportunities that it presents in order to do so. And therefore I'm going to want to train myself up and better understand the business, better understand the world within which our business is operating, and better understand how I can add value, or at least not detract value from this common enterprise.
And one of the challenges that on this topic is that particularly the leadership of the companies are often so focused on the operational and strategic challenges that they face that they neglect the investment that's needed to groom those owners that you need. And it feels almost like a distraction from where the real action is. But when times get tough, that investment becomes critical for survival, because you need to know how to manage the owners, what goes on above the CEOs, if you're going to create the conditions necessary for resiliency. And again, we talk about it in the book. We also wrote an article for Harvard Business Review on crisis governing, because there's a lot written about crisis management, but not much about crisis governing. And a key part of crisis governing is keeping your owners informed and with you, right? Because as things heat up, you want them on your side, because you're actually managing their capital. And that again, that doesn't just happen. It happens because there's intention in creating the conditions for that to occur.
Well, I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to just finish with this one last question. Towards the end of the book, you provide a formula for building an enduring enterprise. You talk about proactive planning plus adaptive response plus enhanced recovery is what equals an enduring enterprise. Anything you'd say about kind of that math equation?
Sure, Dave. We're chatting with a colleague who was quoting Carl Sagan as saying that in order to truly understand any phenomenon, you ought to be able to frame an equation that helps to explain the dynamics or the phenomenon you're trying to share. And so, we took that in jest, but also seriously. The idea is that there are in fact three major components to this model. As it all began to coalesce for us, we recognized that some of this is just about anticipating risk. It's recognizing that we are not impervious to risk, and if anything, especially in advanced economies, we are probably not tracking the increased frequency and increased impact of the shocks that are coming our way in a variety of vectors, from technological change, which we're all now tracking more closely, but also social unrest and market failures and demographic trends and environmental threats that together are combining to suggest that we ought to have a plan for this, especially if we're a family committed to generational success, multi-generational success. These are slow-moving forces that will manifest over decades, not over weeks. And so if we want to be around in 100 years, we need to plan for 100-year storms, so to speak, which are happening at increasing frequencies. The adaptive response piece is about being nimble when the crisis hits. And so we've got a whole chapter in the book on navigating crises with confidence. And as these crises are unfolding, there's much that families can do, leveraging of the cases that we share in the book and some of the ideas, but also with their own intuition to recognize that, the goal here is to survive to the extent possible until the other side of the storm passes. You batten down the hatches and try to push through, or adapt and pivot and persevere. But the aspiration is to get through the most challenging moment so that you can live to die another day, as the old James Bond saying goes. And then the enhanced recovery piece is really about what do we do after these crises? And there are countless cases in the book where we capture the stories of businesses that emerged from traumatic events, not only, intact, but also doing even better than they had been coming into the crisis, because they were able to be proactive and preemptive in their planning for it. So they minimized the initial shock. They were able to pivot more quickly and find their stable footing and ride out the storm with greater confidence. And then as their peers and competitors were struggling to move their way through that turbulent environment and emerge on the other side, some would collapse. And so they were buying up and acquiring. They were hoovering up market share, so to speak, because they got there faster. They got there with more resources and more stability, and were able to outperform substantially in the long run. And there's terrific research that we include in the book on the degree of that outperformance. So really, it's a combination of thinking about crisis in advance, the Boy Scouts Be Prepared construct, the being nimble and resilient in the face of the conflict itself, and to be able to bounce back even better at the tail end of a crisis. And you do that time and time again over the resilience cycle, and over generations, you can significantly outperform.
Amazing. Thank you. Yvonne, any
connecting
closing thoughts?
Sorry. No, I was just connecting that with the prior conversation we were having about ownership, because one of the interesting things you see in families that have been around for generations in these environments is that they also have an institutional memory of how they cope with these things in the past, that they can tap to be able to come up with strategies and it's to respond effectively to the changes they're facing now. So that too becomes that inventory. It becomes part of their resilience as well.
Well, Devin,
but great conversation. Thank you.
Well, Devin and Yvonne, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed your book. It's a book that is not to be hurried through, so I will be spending more time with it. But thank you so much for joining me on Authors at Drucker. Next on Authors at Drucker, we'll have the opportunity to interview Bernie Jaworski about his book, The Organic Growth Playbook. And for all of you listening, I hope you'll join that conversation. So thanks again for joining us on Authors at Drucker.